Ali will be joining us shortly. First up is public appearances. There are 2 public appearances tonight. I believe that both of you have spoken before, but you have 3 minutes. I'll time you on this. And Andy, you are up first. Yep, it should be on if it's not red, right?
There we go. All right.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm all dressed up for the evening. Don't usually wear a tie for these. My dad always questioned as to why I didn't wear a tie as a high school teacher in the 50s and 60s. He always thought I should wear a tie. I didn't understand as an elementary teacher that wasn't quite the same thing. So as you may have guessed, I'm here to speak on one issue that's of great importance to MTI members and all MMSD staff, and that's the cost of living adjustment to the base wage. And don't worry, this isn't my speech, so that'll come later. So this issue's been before the board for quite a while now, and especially ever since we had the 2.13 adjustment last year was agreed to the spring of 2018. So we've negotiated where we can, met and conferred, worked together in many ways to try to build a stronger educational community. That 2.13% was almost as much as the total of all the increases to the base wages since 2011, and that's an example of why this issue is so important to staff. During that time, since 2011, employees have also experienced changes such as added costs in the form of our WS contributions, seen choices in health care insurance eliminated. Things continued, such as their need for many employees to work additional jobs during the summers and school year, continuing costs as employees buy materials for classrooms and students, and the ever-increasing workload that we absorb at no small cost to our health and personal lives. And through all this, our employees have continued to show up every day and do their best to support their students and serve the community. And we recognize that school funding is part of a much bigger picture. You may have seen today supporters of public education gathered in Milwaukee to welcome Betsy DeVos when she visited a religious private voucher school that steals money from the public schools in Milwaukee, and we know that exists across the state. We know there will always be those who want to profit from our students. MTI members stand in solidarity with those who oppose these efforts to destroy our public schools, and we're ready to continue our efforts to engage in work that builds and supports a system of public education that serves each and every student of our community. And that includes compensation for our employees as well. What we don't accept is that budgets need to be balanced at the expense of staff and students. That thinking is just what the opponents of public education want us to have. We've shared facts with you. Members have sent you messages. You've seen us gather outside this building in August. And now I'm delivering a petition that's signed by over 4,000 people calling for the district to provide that 2.44, the full 2.44 cost of living adjustment to all employees. I ask that you consider what your employees need and deserve as you continue your discussions later this evening. Thank you.
I got it. I teach 7th grade, so I'll just stand right here. I'm just supporting the raise. I hope we get the raise. That's it. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that marks the end of our public appearances. Thank you to everybody who came to speak. We also have a number of comments here that I'll pass around. We are going to move directly into our main presentation tonight. So Kelly and is Lisa, there aren't any minutes to approve tonight. Thank you though, Nikki. So maybe just to quickly frame the discussion, and then I'll pass it over to Jane and Kelly. This is our first discussion of not this year's budget, but the following year. So this is our opportunity to pivot from some of the kind of detailed work that we've been doing over the last months to finalize the 1920 budget and move into the 2021 discussion. So Kelly and Lisa are going to lead us through that discussion. Our role tonight is a couple of things. So just to kind of keep in mind the things that we'd like to collectively come away with the discussion tonight. The first is some direction on the potential of an operating to exceed referendum to give administration direction on how the board would like to progress that discussion. And that's really the core goal of this evening. Following from that, there are kind of more details around levels of funding, alternative scenarios to explore, and community engagement. But that's kind of the primary goals for feedback tonight. And then I'll pass it. Jane, I don't know if you wanted to make any comments or directly over to Kelly. So.
I'll just say that this is like really important work that we're considering tonight, and I just hope we can keep in mind the big picture of all the moving pieces. And those include a superintendent search, the referendum that you talked about, and at the same time really doing the important work that we do in schools and the focus that we've taken on equity and instruction this year. So I think just kind of keep those as a framework for you tonight. Thanks.
All right. We will pause a couple of different times in the discussion, so if you can kind of hold questions, there's 2 break points that we'll take questions at. So, okay.
All right, so to start us off, let's talk about our objectives for tonight. Kate just opened it up nicely. Basically, our objectives for tonight are to start the planning process for our future. There are no decisions that you're being asked to make tonight, but we will be discussing our assumptions on our future revenue trends and our state funding challenges. As Kate mentioned, we look forward to some board direction on where we might go as we start to open up the community feedback input sessions that have been planned for the facilities referendum, such that if the board is looking for more community input on a potential operating to exceed, that we could do that work kind of simultaneously over the next few months. But where we'll start out sorry, it's a slightly old version, that's okay, is looking at our overall revenue impact for the district. So you see in front of you two of our main revenue streams. The first one, our revenue limit, which is the blue line that you see on the chart in front of you tonight. The blue line has been the traditional way that the state has funded public education around the revenue limit. So for dozens of years, public schools have been funded by a revenue limit. The state gives a limit, and we either get the funding through state equalization aid or through property taxes. When the Walker administration started, in order to lower property taxes, they essentially made the revenue limit as a tool null and void. You see the great big negative up on the screen, and then zeros for the upcoming years. Instead, the Walker administration implemented a new revenue trend called the per pupil categorical aid. That's the orange line you see up on the screen. So the orange line was public education funding via the state budget, not local property taxes. So ultimately what it did is it held down the local property tax somewhat artificially. And those two things matter because what we're seeing now with the Evers administration, and we try to project our revenue trend for the future, is the coming back of the revenue limit and no longer the use of the per pupil categorical aid. And our budget that the state just passed pretty clearly says that. So we were able to get an $88 per member increase out of the budget this year in that per pupil categorical aid, but it very clearly states 0 for 2021 and for every year thereafter, giving us that signal on this reliance on the revenue limit as our main revenue source moving forward. We've been lucky. Then in 2016, the local voters passed an operating to exceed referendum, which gave us $26 million of authority above and beyond that revenue limit to increase the revenue in order to invest in our local priorities. The result is that our local taxpayers now currently fund 71% of our operating budget and the state 21% of our operating budget. A wild difference from the 2/3 funding model that the state used to support and that Governor Evers tried to get through in this current budget cycle. So it's important because that is the way we have been working, is relying on the local revenue sources. So it's extremely important to recognize that through this process, through the budgeting process of the last 6 years, we've been able to maintain a budgeting process that carries out important steps in order to balance the budget, where every year we look at every piece of our budget. We look at our staffing schedules, we look at our total compensation, and we have to make decisions on the highest leverage investments. We look at the investments in our strategic framework priorities. We decide what we should continue and what we should stop. And what that has allowed us to do is support our overall investment in equitable opportunities that work for students, a variety of student programming needs in arts, music, science, technology, in our local class sizes, and maintaining MMSD as an employer of choice, both attracting and retaining high-quality teachers. While doing that, we've repurposed over $17 million of our budget in the last 6 years, between $2 and $3 million a year. So it's a disciplined way of working that we've developed, the board and the administration together over the years, and that process will continue. We will continue to need to go through this disciplined way of working to evaluate our highest leverage strategies. So what you see on the slide in front of you is the increases on salary over time in order to ensure that we have the highest leverage investments into staff and staff retention. But when we start to look at the revenue for moving forward for the future, what we see is some changes due to those revenue formulas. So if you look at the 1920 column right in front of you, you'll see that we had a number of new revenue streams, about $15 million worth of new revenue this year, which was able to fund our existing kind of strategies around our expenses, leaving us with a small budget gap at the end of the year that we repurposed from within, as we always do, to get to the balanced budget that we're at today. But when you look at the orange kind of box there, looking forward to the future, what we know for 2021 is that our categorical aid will be 0, and that we will no longer have new revenue authority from our 2016 operating to exceed, leaving us with just under $5 million of new revenue for 2021, and just a little more than that for 21-22, 22-23 school year. If we were to continue on our expenditure kind of plans and our investments that we have been making, what this would leave us with is an approximate $10 million budget gap for our 2021 school year, which is the upcoming budget year, and then $10 million budget gap for the upcoming 2 years. Now we have a long road ahead of us as far as a budgeting process. We have 7-8 months before any big decisions need to be made. There's a lot of discussions that we'll have, right? We'll have discussions around our existing expenditures. We'll have discussions around staffing, class size, around central office supports, and around non-teaching supports. We'll have discussions on compensation. We'll have discussions on healthcare, and we'll have discussions on our equity projects. All of these discussions and conversations will need to ensue around discussions to balance the budget. But that isn't our only tool either. We also do have a revenue creation tool aligned to potentially going back to referendum for the local voters for an operating to exceed question. So there are a lot of tools and a lot of discussions at your disposal that we'll start to have in the upcoming months. If we were to balance the budget without any new revenue, there's a number of options that we can take. Just looking at one option, if we were to pull approximately $3 million kind of out of the FTE step and lane scheduled portion of our budget, we would still be able to fund base wage at 2%, for example. We would need to keep healthcare at 0, meaning we would need to do potentially plan design, good negotiations with our healthcare providers. And we would need to keep our equity projects at 0, repurposing from within to continue to fund the strategic framework priorities. So there's many options here. There's hundreds of line items in our budget. But this is kind of an example of just one of many strategies that we would need to be looking at in the upcoming months in order to balance the budget. Looking at our potential other strategy around identifying new resources in order to ensure that Madison's momentum around our academic achievements continue, would be potentially looking at to going to referendum to gain additional revenue. The orange bars in front of you, this is a very simplistic graph of the 2016 referendum, where we passed a $5 million in 16-17, $5 million in 17-18, $8 million in 18-19, and $8 million in 19-20 of authority to exceed the revenue limit. And we were able to keep property taxes relatively low over the last 6 years because of the growth in Madison. One strategy would be for the board to consider going to referendum for $8 million in 2021, $8 million in 21-22, and $10 million each for the 2 years thereafter. What that would do would be allow the board to continue kind of the current ways of working in our disciplined budget process while also holding that momentum and sustainability of the district going forward. I'm going to pause
Yeah,
here.
why don't we pause? We just moved pretty quickly through that.
Yep.
I think Barb is also going to maybe pull the presentation down and just quickly flip it back up. I think Kelly's the first part of this presentation is really around the forecast, and then the second is more around the impact should we move to referendum. So if there's questions about, I think, the financial forecast that Kelly just walked through, now would be a good time to raise them. Yeah, Chris.
Sure. So, Kelly, thank you so much for reaching out to me earlier with about my questions about the special education money that is in Governor Evers' budget. As you confirmed in your email, there's about $3 million in categorical aid reimbursement for special education coming up in the 2021 budget, and you did point out that we don't actually get reimbursed until December of 2020, correct? Is when we get reimbursed for that, or 2021?
First, the special education funding that Governor Evers put in the budget that just passed is not a categorical aid that you get in the beginning of the year and you get to spend. It's not a new revenue. It's a reimbursement, meaning we go through the year, they look at how much we spend, and they then reimburse us 30% after the year is over. So the December of 20, after the school year 19-20 is over, is when we would get the funding from the state. So it's not new revenue, but we do include it in our budgeting process. The Baird model we always put in the back of the budget book, and we will again this year, hundreds of budgetary lines and decisions. And that, looking at our trend data, we are anticipating will be somewhere in the realm of about $3 million of reimbursement aid that we would receive.
So that reimbursement aid is basically shifting some special education funding out of Fund 10 and into Fund 27, correct?
Actually, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
So every year, on average, somewhere between $8 million and $10 million of additional supports comes out of Fund 10 and goes to Fund 27. So every year, we're investing $8 to $10 million more in special education students. That's been our history. So what'll happen is instead of an $8 million transfer, the special education budget will have $3 million more. So we don't need as large of a transfer from Fund 10 over to Fund 27. So there's no money going back from 27 to 10. It's just that what goes from 10 to 27 will be reduced.
That's really helpful. I still am curious, like in the budget forecast you put up there, is that $3 million? That's not a small amount of money if we're looking at a $10 million budget hole, and I'm just wondering where that increase is reflected.
Yep. So in the full budget model, it is in there, and had we not received this 30% increase, we would need to have sent a bigger transfer from Fund 10 over to Fund 27. Thus, our gap would be $3 million more.
Okay.
The slide that's up here is intentionally high level, so I can understand that's kind of, not really called out here, but it's absolutely in the full budget detail. That's the behind the scenes work of the slide up there.
Okay. I I also have a question on the multi-year budget without new revenue, where we show our health insurance premium increase going to 0.
Yeah.
How do we accomplish that?
Well, we have a great history with MTI of some really good negotiations with our unions. This is an area where we negotiate with our unions, with our healthcare providers. This is an area where we actually negotiate those contracts together. And we have had years in the past where we've been able to negotiate a 0% increase. That would be our goal. If a 0% increase can't be accomplished through negotiations, we would continue to look at plan design to try to get down to a 0% increase. And once we've kind of exhausted some of those sources, we would work with you and the union to potentially look at employee percentage contribution changes.
So basically, this side is showing that we're taking a pretty big chunk of this $10 million hole and we're putting it on staff. Like, we're taking it out of step and lanes, we're asking them to potentially pay more of their health insurance costs if we can't negotiate down to 0 or change their plans.
So as I mentioned, this is a really high-level slide, and as there's still $2 million left on the bottom of each of those rows that continues to need to be funded. So that $2 million would come from the rest of the budget. So no, they're not being all on the backs of staff. There's still $2 million identified there that have not been cut. And when you're looking at the steps and lane schedule, I just want to be really clear that that's all staff, right? That's not just teachers. Central office staff are in that line item too.
So one thing we've talked about as a board a little bit, and I think we need to talk about more, is actually changing the process we use to develop the budget a little bit better so that we're actually on an ongoing basis both talking about our staff and how we compensate our staff and working conditions more than just like, here's what we have to cut, but here's how we support people. And also looking at the ways we work, looking at things like professional development and outside consultants and other major investments we make and programs we have in place, and asking the good hard question of, is this the best use of our money? I think if we're in a tight budget year, we have to do that. We have to put everything on the table and start deciding where are we investing money where maybe we shouldn't be, because it's not having the outcomes we want to produce for our kids.
Agreed.
So.
I know Nikki has some comments she wants to make. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly, the scenario that was just up is a scenario that you painted of essentially a way to move forward without additional revenue sources.
That's right.
But it's not a recommendation at this point.
That's correct.
It's kind of information for the board to absorb.
That's correct.
And do what we will with. Ali.
I guess we're talking very specifically about the projections based on both kind of local property tax and state revenue. Is there anything that could change that reality as informed by the state? So what would create a shift in support from the state at this point?
So there's nothing that's likely to change for 2021, right? Because the budget's been passed. Trying to predict the 21-23 budget cycle is very hard to do at this point. Surely Governor Evers will have a chance to put forward another budget and potentially move closer to the 2/3 funding model, which I would benefit Madison potentially more than any other school district in the state. So any movement the state can make for more funding, bilingual, bicultural aid, just for example, is positive movement for the school district. But we can't, we have to be very careful. We can't plan for that kind of shift in the state. If we were to get there by 21, 22, and have additional authority to exceed the referendum, the board could very well choose not to use it because you don't need it, because the state was able to start to switch funding models. This is projecting a $200 per member increase, which is already more than we're getting today, assuming he's going to get something out of the next budget in movement upwards. But it's sure not, anticipating getting everything from the state we would like to get. And if we're in that stage, the board could absolutely leave revenue authority on the table and not use it if you don't need it.
Nikki, did you have a comment?
And I ended up forgetting what it
Okay.
was. Thank you.
Ananda?
I want to at least question the slide around the, that shows the state revenue limits and then per pupil category. Can you explain again, like how you reconciling, how you reconciling the per pupil aid and then the revenue limit change, and then you're already predicting a slow for low on 2021?
Yep. So the blue line is the revenue limit, and that's what we're starting to see Evers move back and use that tool, as you can see, in the blue bar coming back, right, from 0 up to 175 and then to 179. So the budget projections after 2021, which is the years we don't know, include $200 per pupil. So that would be another tick upwards if you were to add in the next year in the blue line. It's the orange line, which is the tool the Walker administration used, that very clearly states in the budget $0 for 2021 and every year thereafter. That's the signal that us and other school districts are relying on, that says this categorical aid per pupil is probably a tool of the past. And we're probably moving forward to some of the similar funding models using the revenue limit that we've had.
So given, one last question.
Yeah.
Given so many uncertainties and variables I really appreciate how sharp analysis you give to demonstrate this. I am curious about like what you're thinking, going back to Chris's comment around how do we engage in the budget process that actually the forefront value people's, value workers, value their pay without transferring that the climate landscape uncertainty that we have in the political sphere to their everyday like compensation.
Yeah. I mean, I think the primary items are some of the difficult conversations that we do need to happen in the January, February time period of the budget. You can't push off some decisions for later. So I think the board, taking on some real good work in January, February, early in the budget process would absolutely be needed. Lisa, do you have other thoughts on that?
It is a tricky, timing conversation because we have to start getting the schools set up for the following year and start planning for that, like in the months of January and February, so that workbooks and allocations, and we can staff schools with with teachers that they need so they can get working. And we know that our teachers make up a good percentage of our budget. Our FTE, our people are our most valuable resource. So we have to be thinking about that all the time, and we want to get our schools set up first to do well as they start to plan for the next year.
And do one follow-up. What I struggle, thank you, Lisa, for that comment. What I struggle is, I have heard that the January conversation for us to pick up in January, and like you said, and Kelly, you mentioned, we're talking about also compensation for other employees. And so we are constantly in the space that we're advocating for one group, and then there's this other group of staff that have not benefit necessarily from steps and lane, or that, we needed to look. But then by the time, the egg comes, we don't know where the chicken is at, and then it just goes into this revolving cycle, and then we have new board members that gets really upset in the summer that we have not done a really humane way.
I mean, the timing of how we run the budget is it's our decision, right? The budget is ultimately the board is accountable for it, right? So I think what I hear you saying is, in terms of making some of the big rock decisions, base wage is one of those, that we could talk about that earlier. We did run the last year's budget cycle with kind of visibility into those assumptions, but we could attempt to move some of those discussions earlier. I think I do want to separate the timing, which that's our collective decision, from I think some of what's on the page here, just in terms of literally if we want to do that, moving out of the last 4 years where we've had referendum support into the next 4 years, we have to make a decision around revenue sources to support our kids and our staff. So I
Thank you, because the timing is one, but what I'm also looking for is like, where is the creativity around
understand.
doing something
Absolutely.
different?
Yep.
Thank you.
Nikki.
I would like to actually amplify Nanda's comments. Every year that I've been on this board, we've been told we will go start earlier in January so that we can discuss base wage. It has occurred every year. Every year that we've had a board member, at least one, ask, when are we going to discuss base wage, and be told there are too many programs that need to be funded and therefore we are unable to fund base wage or discuss it until afterwards if there's enough left over. My question is, how do we prevent this from happening? And I mean this with all due respect. We're a team here, we are one unit, and how do we make sure that everyone gets along, yet we still include them and put that decision truly first? How do we do that? Can that be done?
So I'm going to jump in because I kind of want to frame where we're at. So I mean, having watched the last 4 years and some of the ability to invest that we've had, which was really fueled by the last referendum. Mike Berry would always add thank you to our community after that statement. So thank you to our community. I mean, when I look at, Kelly, what you've put on paper here, I don't think we can proceed with the type of growth and investment in our schools and kids that we would like to do without exploring the option of another operating to exceed referendum. And I say that with some caution, I guess, because we are also looking at a capital referendum that I think is critical for the city right now and critical for the future of our schools. And those two things are, we as a group are going to need to balance the investment that is asking of our local, of our community, of our city. So for me, I guess just to kind of progress the discussion around the operating referendum, I do think we need to explore it. I would like to be as creative and as cautious as possible with respect to the numbers there. The last referendum that we explored, we had 5588, so an ability to exceed the revenue limit by $5 million, $5 million, 8 and 8, incrementally each year. And personally, I'd love to start this discussion in a similar place, just from a kind of quantitative perspective, and that is something we don't have all of the facts for yet. Kelly will look to you over the next 6 to 12 months for that, but I would like to get the group's perspective on, is there alignment to proceed down this path? It's a lot of work for the administration. What are some of the avenues that we want to explore in addition to or in place of an operating referendum? So I'll say one more thing. For me, there's a couple of other things I would like to explore, both from a revenue source as well as cost reduction. On the revenue source, I mean, kids are our best revenue source. And so I would really like to, and I'm not sure this is the right year or if there's appetite, but I would love to continue to explore the idea of a magnet school for arts, something really big and bold that we believe could attract kids to the district that may be open and rolling out right now. We have a STEM investment with Madison College. It's getting great traction. We'll talk more about that next week. So I think, and again, it could be very creative in terms of what that looks like. The other on the cost side, there are a couple of scenarios that we've kind of slightly explored previously. One is whole school DLI. I'd like to see if there's an appetite to explore that. It, I think, is good for kids, good for buildings, and allows for more efficient staffing models. That wouldn't be a one-year decision, but it's something that we could start to explore. I think we've talked a little bit about multi-age, and again, the small schools, for me, we have a number of very small elementary schools, and to the degree we could do something creative while also efficient from a staffing perspective with those schools, I would really like to explore those. So those are my kind of maybe cost ideas that I'd like to throw out there just for if there's momentum around any. Okay, Ali and then Nikki.
Yeah, so I think I really appreciate that framework, Kate, and I particularly appreciate you talking about full school dual language immersion as an option to both promote equity and inclusion and a cost savings. One of the things I just want to kind of point out as we have this conversation is the idea of equity as an expense and that framework and kind of the damage that that does to equity. When we say our equity projects as kind of an expense, I think the idea becomes that inequity is affordable, and I don't know who to, but not me personally, and so I think that conversation is an area of incredible tension, and it's also a theme in terms of who ends up on the chopping block. So we talk about our equity projects as an expense differently than we would talk about our athletics as an expense, right? And that is something I'd like to see us reconsider.
Nikki?
I was going to state one, would agree to, on the operating referendum. I think it's a necessity. I think the first thing we need to do is to focus on teachers and staff. I think that will help with retention. Number two, the full-scale DLI sounds incredibly interesting, incredibly promising, as long as the buildings are accessible that they're in. And by accessible, I also mean looking at the operating referendum on the air conditioning issue, because when you have individuals, especially quadriplegic or people who cannot self-regulate body temperature, it's not a truly fully accessible program. And my colleague Ali put it probably best. Equity shouldn't be whether or not it's expensive or not. It's something you just need to do, and these children need that ability as much. Right now, our black and brown children with disabilities have the least number of resources in this district. Showed up every year since I've been on the board, and it's showed up before that. We have a chance to change that. I think we need to do it.
So I think, we are, in going through this every year, it's always harder and harder. We are in a budget, I don't want to say crisis, but it's a challenge, and we're trying to balance all these things, right? We can't have everything, and it would be nice, right, to have everything. We are just not, that's just not doable, and I think we have to really stick with our priorities, change them when need be, right? Equity should be on the forefront of those decisions, but we have to keep in mind as a board that I'm in support of going out for a referendum, but I'm really concerned. That means, taxes go up, and I just want us to be very careful in moving in this direction, right, and not losing focus, and staying on track with our priorities, considering our budgets, right? We just can't have everything. We can't. I would love to continue to keep raises up for all of our staff in the school district. Continue to invest in our equity projects to support our students of color that we are failing, right? There are challenges within our schools with our students right now. And I just want to, I don't want to get us into a place where we're talking about we want to do this, we want to do that. I think we have to really come back and stay focused, realize this is what we have and this is what we faced with, and we have to make a decision based on what we have. And, in looking in projected years. Oh, go ahead.
All right, Ananda.
I'm in support of the referendum. I know that there was a number thrown, like, I'm wondering if you know, or Callie knows, like, what's the maximum, or what's the window that we're looking, what's the range that we're looking at? Maximum,
My next couple of slides.
oh, is it? Okay.
So Savion hasn't commented, and then maybe we can keep going and,
I just was.
Okay. yep, that's fine.
I appreciate that, Chair. I really do.
Yeah, just a few things. In support of the idea of a referendum, I think it is incredibly important to our equity initiatives for the district. And as you said, we have to consider all options to compete for enrollment in the area. But in many ways, this referendum is a test of the community's commitment to equity in our school system. So,
And just someday I'll learn. Just one thing, Gloria said it very well. We do have to be cautious. We don't have a blank checkbook, nor are we going to. At the same point, funding cost of living increases is a very important thing. And we need to make sure we can do it. We need to make sure we can take care of our own, and we can't always do everything. And I appreciate you keeping us grounded on that. Thank you.
All right, Kelly, keep going.
So to Ananda's earlier point.
You pick
So-
with us, because I can never.
Yep.
I don't know where all the slides are.
Okay. Sorry, I think there might have been a passing challenge that I was not aware of. Okay, thank you. All right, so the chart in front of you is an illustrative version of what a mill rate impact would be. The blue bars signify our ongoing district operations. So without a referendum, the projected mill rate is the blue bar that you see on the screen in front of you. The orange bar signifies what an operating to exceed referendum would look like at a mill rate if we were to go to the local taxpayers with $8 million, $8 million, $10 million, $10 million. Continuing from the slide that we saw just a minute ago. And then you have the building excellence referendum layered in on top. That's the conversation we've been having had over a year now around our investments into our high school strategy and the potential of a new elementary school in the South Alice area. So 72 cents for a mill rate is a pretty, a decent step for that first year in 2021. When you look at it over time, what you see is over time our mill rate has been decreasing pretty significantly from 15-16. This is a combination of a number of things working in our favor. One, I mentioned earlier that Governor Walker's use of the per pupil categorical aid kind of artificially kept the mill rate low. It was an unsustainable revenue source, but it is what helped keep some of the property taxes low. In addition to that, Madison has benefited from an 8.5% increase in our local property tax base. That's pretty huge. It's the highest in the state. And so that has been helping to keep our mill rate low over the years as well. Built into our model, and one of the reasons why these numbers are a little bit higher, is we are projecting that that growth rate will start to slow a bit. So by the time you get out to 22, 23, we've kind of conservatively put in 3% growth a couple of years out. Madison could go well beyond, our expectations in growth, which will help to keep those numbers below what I just projected for you. Ultimately, though, when you look at this over time, we start to return to a mill rate that we've seen back in 15-16, almost coming back to a more normalcy level of a mill rate. And in a kind of per impact for the average homeowner, right now in Madison, projecting a $295,000 average cost of an average home here in the city. That's been growing pretty quickly. So that growth is also calculated into what the per year impact would be on an average home. So that 72 cents does equate to about $300 for the 2021 school year. And then you see about a $100 increase in the 2 years thereafter. and then really starting to level out and ultimately decreasing over time as the facilities start to pay themselves off over time. So can Madison afford it is kind of the question that you get, or that's probably on your mind. And with your support of going to the community for feedback over the next 2 months, our goal is to get that question answered for you. Kind of where are we? Is this the right, is it 8, 10, 10 the right thing to do? Should the board go higher? Should the board go lower? Some of the information that we'll get out of the feedback process. But if you point your kind of eyes right into the middle where this orange kind of circle is, what we've seen is Verona and Sun Prairie have all gone to pretty significant referendums in the recent few years, increasing their mill rate. Madison is nowhere near the Verona mill rate, and as it comes as a percentage of what the school district collects out of the total municipal mill rate, Madison is actually further behind than our local counterparts. So if we were to go to referendum, and if these two questions, the facilities and the operating to exceed, were to pass, we still would be below Verona, and we would be on par with Sun Prairie as it comes to the school district's impact on the local property taxes. The referendums are kind of like a leapfrog, right? So we'll go, and then eventually somebody else will go, and we'll kind of continue to leapfrog each other, would be my prediction. So just to kind of wrap this up for you before Kate opens it up for discussion again, looking for your confirmation that when we go out to the community that we're planning for a November 2020 ballot for these two questions, both facilities and operating to exceed. So long as that's the case, our next steps, as I just mentioned, are to get feedback over the next couple of months from the community on these two questions. October is a big month. We get a lot of confirmed numbers from the state, final numbers from the state. We'll bring back a final budget for 1920 for you at the end of October, but it'll also give us the ability to update some of these numbers and some of our assumptions by the time we talk again in November. Board will continue the conversations. We'll dive deeper into the budget process. We'll come back together then in January. According to this plan, to kind of confirm where we are at with these two questions and if this is something that the board wants to continue to move forward on. Ultimately, by the May time frame, if we're going to November ballot, the board would probably want to start to weigh in on the actual kind of scope and wording of the questions, so we have them done before the summer begins.
Questions? Gloria?
So, it looks like the 2015-2016 mill rate levels were about the same as we're estimating.
There's just a few cents difference in there.
Really, what was happening, or what happened during that time? Do you remember? What?
Well, that was kind of our more stable rate. That's where taxes. If you were to, take that back even further, you see your mill rate just kind of going up and down.
Okay.
So the real change here is what you see on the screen.
Right.
Is Madison's property base just really grew in this time period, which has helped hold the impact on each individual home down because the base was so much bigger. I mean, it's the cranes and the condos that you see going up all around us that had a major impact on bringing that down. And then we did have the state make some maneuvers to keep property taxes low, particularly around some of our election years.
Great, thank you.
Chris?
So first of all, I fully support going to an operating referendum. In fact, it's hard for me to fathom asking our taxpayers to invest a lot of money in our buildings while we're not concurrently making an investment in our staff, which is what the operating referendum would do. We need to invest in both. I think we need to have another conversation and a much more detailed conversation about the point you brought up about enrollment and gaining efficiencies. I think those are really important questions. Increasing our revenues and gaining more efficiencies through how we run our schools is a great lever to try to change the funding scenario in Madison. And I think it warrants a 20-minute meeting. It's so in-depth. When we talk about things like going to multi-age classrooms, which we had back when my kids were in elementary school, and some parents loved them, some parents didn't. I happen to be in the love category. It really needs to not just be about efficiency, but it needs to be an intentional pedagogical strategy. It has to be about how we teach. So that's why getting some staff input into changes like that, I think, is absolutely critical. And finally, I would like to talk about not just doing an operating referendum, but how we time it. I am really concerned about the November timing of the operating referendum because we're essentially going into a June budget vote with a lot of uncertainty, and we're asking a new superintendent to come into a really, really uncertain, unstable budget, where if we pass a referendum, it's going to be great, and if we don't pass a referendum, we have this big gaping hole. I feel like a spring vote still needs to be on the table, if for nothing else, because we'll be bringing in a new superintendent to a much more stable situation, and also because it means we won't have to pass 2 budgets, which, you know, the bulk of which are going to impact our staff the way it's being laid out right now. We're going to have a budget where they are possibly absorbing more of their health care, looking at health plan changes, as well as smaller step lane and base wage increases, and then one that's better if we are able to pass that referendum. I'm not comfortable with that, so I'd like to talk about timing.
Ali?
I think I appreciate what you have to say in consideration of timing. I also am in support of going to referendum for Exceed Stop Rate. I think being able to hear from the community and render community support is really essential to our ability to be successful in pursuit of both referendums. And so if you all could speak to that component of this work, it'd be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of brushed over it. So I appreciate you calling us back to this. So the current plan for November 20 is based on ensuring that we have kind of not just one chance, but 2 chances at community input. So our current phase is starting next week, and that's the mid-September to kind of mid-December timeline, where we get community input. We have a number of sessions that we're working on and planning, getting scheduled right now. But we don't know what we're going to get out of that yet. And when we start to process the information in December and January with you all, the hope is that we would have kind of February and March to hone in on what we're hearing. Maybe ask a second level question to make sure we can adjust and get it right. If we were to go in April, what would happen is the board would have to need to take their official vote the week of January 13th in order to ensure that we can meet the deadlines in the clerk's office to get those questions filed. So January 13th really shortens that timeline for what we hear from the community, our time to turn that around to you all, and for you all to make decisions on what the 2 questions are, how much we're going to ask, because you will have to vote on that decision the week of January 13th.
A follow-up question I have very specifically about kind of the base that informs property tax for Madison is looking at the annexation of Town of Madison and recently looking at kind of different spaces in Madison in which property tax is negotiated differently. So looking at places that MMSD serves, but that don't necessarily have the same sort of property tax implications. So places like Town of Bloomington or kind of these smaller spaces, what does the annexation of those communities indicate in terms of revenue for us?
Well, our property tax base is already calculated on the areas of which MMSD serves. So whether they're kind of annexed or not, they're already in our count, so our base. So our base doesn't change because the town suddenly joins the city. It would only change if somebody joins Madison Metropolitan School District, and those boundaries don't change. So the city boundaries and the Madison School District boundaries are different.
But are there implications in terms of the annexation and what a person's property tax would be?
So the property tax dollars that I have projected right here, or that I had projected in this slide, our mill rate we calculate, and the average your tax bill is based on the value of your home. So if the town of Madison's average home value is $200,000 and not $295,000, your taxes will be going up at the same rate, but at a lower, like average home. So nothing changes in that calculation due to that. Your home is still the value. Now, if the value of your home changes, because suddenly your home is worth more because it's in the city of Madison, Then, once your house gets assessed at a higher rate, you would start to see higher property taxes. So, but that would be like a second level.
Right, so the city of Madison installs a sidewalk in town of Madison that ups the value of the property.
Right.
We ultimately,
If the value increases because the city made investments, our property value grows, and that homeowner's property value might go up, which could make property taxes higher.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Savion.
Yeah, I think Kelly makes a really good point about the reality that we're in, is that, you know, as the city of Madison grows, the boundaries proper grow, that we don't automatically get those student enrollments, so we really need to have a good strategy about increasing our enrollment and all the things we can do that, and considering all options on the table for that.
Thank you.
So, I think, you know, I understand, Chris, your concerns about, and the advantages of doing in April. If we had, I think in the scenario that we had a superintendent in place right now, I think I would feel really comfortable in that. Where we're in the middle of a superintendent search, makes me sort of hesitant in doing an April referendum. I think it provides us more time. We'd have someone already selected by that time, and that provides some stability to our school. And then it also, I mean, I think from Ali's point too, is the community engagement component is really important for us in moving through a referendum, right, question, and what is it that our community wants, and if we do even have the support. To have this in February and then to put this in April, it really is a tight timeline. So those are just my concerns about that.
Kelly, can you speak to the timing last time and how we did the referendum 4 years ago in terms of the budget and timing? Because we did that in November.
We did. Couple of things. So the last time we went, we did not have facilities and kind of operating to exceed together. They were kind of a year plus apart. So facilities had already gone and passed. A year passes, and then, you know, we started talking about operating to exceed. And in that process, the board started talking about going to operating to exceed as early as January. Ultimately voted to go to referendum for operating to exceed in August, and then put it on the ballot in November. So the board voted in August and then had kind of the typical time period to get ready for November. But there were ongoing conversations with the board around looking at the upcoming budget gaps, and frankly, coming off a very difficult budget year that predicated all the conversations for the operating to exceed.
And just physically, how did it work with going into a year where there were kind of two scenarios for the budget?
Yeah, so in that year, because it passed in November, we did something similar to what I'm proposing we would do this year, which is we would create two budgets. So you would create a budget for if the referendum does not pass, and you would create a budget for if the referendum would pass. And just like we did then, in October, you would certify two separate levies, a levy if it didn't pass and a levy if it passes. As soon as the referendum is over and we know the outcome, you process the paperwork with the city, the clerk's office, and the state, kind of literally in the next few days after the referendum is over to meet the deadlines. But we automatically then implement and operate on the result of that referendum. Does that help?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Maybe just a couple of comments on timing and community engagement, and then I have a couple of questions for the board. I've really struggled a little bit with this April-November question for a variety of reasons. I feel really strongly we keep the two questions together if we're going to do them within the same year. I think we owe it to taxpayers to give them visibility into the total that we're wanting to invest into our schools. And I think there's a lot of unknowns about moving forward in April. So I personally actually right now, given what we know, think we probably should aim towards a November timeline. That's what we've been talking about publicly for quite some time. I think there's potential for us to learn something that would change that, but it would have to be a pretty big deal. So the second comment I had just on community engagement, I would really like us as a group to explore doing some form of quantitative community engagement, potentially in the form of a poll, so that we can facilitate kind of our understanding of where the city is at, and gather some information around kind of areas of priority, levels of investment that our city is willing to commit to schools, and I just think it would help us through this process to provide a little bit of a fact base to inform some of the decision making. I mean, we ultimately represent taxpayers as well as students and families and staff and a variety of other stakeholders, and I just would love to engage the kind of whole city in a way that's a little bit more formal, given the scale of what we're talking about. So I wanted to throw that out and see what folks thought about engaging in kind of that way. It's something that most of our surrounding cities have done ahead of their referenda, as a way to, again, just kind of facilitate that engagement more broadly than one-on-one can help.
Yeah, I mean, I think just from talking to others around, like Madison College, other school district, is that is something that they did, and I think the advice that I got was, you should be doing this now, and so, I think that would be a really big and next move for us.
Just another fact.
It was I had no idea that this was something that we should actually do. I know our administrative staff, they do, right, a survey of some kind. Can you talk about that, Kelly, a little bit?
So in previous referendum, the idea of using, official polling company to do some polling work, it has come up. And to your earlier point, other school districts use that as a tool as well. Madison typically hasn't. We've talked about it, and it's just never been something that previous boards have fully supported. So instead, what Andrew's team has done over the years, and done very well over the years, is use a survey tool to ask some of the same questions that a polling entity might use to gather feedback from the constituents. And we reach out to more than just our parents and more than just our students through a variety of ways that we have access to emails and whatnot. MSCR being one of them. We have a large number of our community members' information, and that tends to be a good vehicle for us. With that said, we don't use, what a polling data might use. We don't know if who we're surveying are voters or not, if they're likely to go to the polls. That's not the look we put on our data, but we tend to ask for kind of more information. We have qualitative questions. We ask people to give us more. So we tend to have a lot more qualitative input about like what to do. What should we change about the question? What is it about that project? So we get a lot of information. So kind of regardless if you want to move forward on a polling idea, I think we still would want to do something internal, but I would want to be very careful that we're not duplicating work. And so they would need to somehow work together in the very short time frame.
I kind of feel like, given the timeline that the previous referendum operated on was so much longer, that we should explore and use every avenue we have for community engagement now. Like we have a shorter time period, and gathering more information and more feedback will be helpful. So Savion and then Ali.
Yeah, I think given how important these two questions are, that a poll makes a lot of sense for us to gather as much information as possible and read where the city is at.
Ananda or Ali?
I think that there's potential with both methods to miss specific groups of people. So thinking about the November presidential election, which is kind of a, once every 4 years shot at kind of getting some of the highest voter turnout the city sees, and includes kind of these newly registered folks, right?
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about the university population who wouldn't be here for the survey or the poll, who are folks who tend to lean kind of pro-education or pro-progressive. I think that, I want us to cast as large a net as we can and get as diverse representation as possible, and be aware of the fact that both nets are going to miss folks, and I think we have to reconcile that. That being said, I think where I appreciate kind of a multifaceted approach and kind of a diverse look at who we're getting and how. I think I am curious to ask folks who do the survey, so specifically you, Andrew, if there's something you think we should look for from polling that we wouldn't get from the survey. So
happy to weigh in. Kelly is right. Usually when we field a survey, it's kind of akin to how much do you love it or what should we change. When you're headed to something that's this scale, you really want to know, you're going to vote for it? And there is a craft to that, and it's not necessarily something that we have done in the past internally. And as Kelly described in the past, we've had a board that's been more interested in what's the plan, how do you like the plan, what should we change to meet a vision. Those are very, very different functions, and I do think that we would benefit from having an internal function of building awareness of the plan, hearing from the community about what the plan should be, informing some of the questions you might have around programming or scope or scale, those kinds of things. But then really getting down to likelihood of voting, there are better ways to construct that than we have used internally in the past. So pairing those two things together and then trying to keep the duplication at a minimum would be, I think, really beneficial, a good match.
are there things we could get from a poll that would be specifically useful to you all? So is there information that we would gain greater access to using a poll that would complement the survey and that would help you all to be better informed in terms of your ability to do this work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think the short answer is yes. We'd have to spend some more time on which side of the line it would be on and for what purpose, but I definitely think there's a potential for them to not only be not overlapping and not duplicative, but then also additive. So that's a lens that we would have going in to scope the thing and award it and craft the questions. So yeah, I think we ought to be getting more than just two separate instruments. Hopefully they work together in a way that gives a much broader picture of how things are faring in the community.
Yeah, and so that's, really specifically setting them up to work in a way that complements one another and benefits all of us in collaboration.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Ananda.
So, a little bit to Ali's comment around which voters are we talking about next year, right? Like, who are the voters next year that we have underestimated, like, specifically over the last 5 years, what they look like and who they are, where they're at. So for me, it would be interesting to actually have that conversation, like how are we informing and capturing voters that we have in the past either neglected or haven't been part of the conversation for different reasons. And I also want to ask a process question. So right now we're discussing sort of this expensive way in which to both understand question, what's the best question that will yield the better results for voting perspective, and we're also discussing like what all the methods, and so you're trying to get like our
Do we want to explore that as an option additive to some of the specific feedback that Andrew's team will get on
I think, yeah, thank you for that clarification. So given like where we are at and how much the landscape has changed from a voter perspective, and I'm interested in like expanding that to the degree that we can. One bug that is in my head right now is like, what is the cost of that? Like, is that, I don't know how much. I remember us talking about, polling, running for office, and like, no, it's cost prohibitive. But so many things is cost prohibitive for me that I don't know what that amount is.
Kelly, do you want to walk through the process if you were?
Is there a way we could get that at a weekly update? It would just be easier to have a physical manifestation for me to see it.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Kelly, do you want to walk through just the
So
process?
if
and
the
then
board
Are you talking about our
wants to
process?
undertake
Talking about our-
a process of pulling in a polling entity, I don't know that it has to be very expensive, because I think it's a pretty specific scope over a pretty short period of time. So I don't know that it needs to be that expensive, but just to go through the procurement process. The board doesn't have to go to RFP. You could get quotes. That would save you some time. You'd want at least 3 quotes per our process and our policy. The board would look at those quotes, probably call them, talk to them, and then ultimately select one of those quotes. If you are under $20,000, Barb would work with you on getting the right kind of contracts in place, and I would work with Barb, but that would be using the board's budget then, and within the board's authority to do so. If it was over $20,000, we would probably want to, we would need to go to consent, obviously, for yourselves to approve. But once you get up around $20,000, you might want to look at doing an RFP versus the quote process. So that's probably something we'd want to talk a little further about. But I don't think it'd be that much. Opening this process, I had called my counterparts in Sun Prairie and others and kind of talked to them about this months and months ago. And I know that theirs was not over $20,000.
Okay, so I wanted to just kind of go back to maybe a process question, but really for the board. So we have a deadline of either May 25th, marching towards November, or January if for some reason something changed. And I just want to understand, what information do folks here think we need in order to evaluate whether an operating referendum is the right thing to do, and B, what levels to do that at? Because that's going to guide a lot of the team's work over the next 9 months in order to determine what levels we want to.
Can you clarify the levels?
So, I mean, the last referendum was 5-5-8-8, and we will have to make that choice at some point in the next academic year around what that looks like. And I think we just talked through some of the community feedback sources, which will inform that, but there's a fair amount of work that the administrative team will need to do to inform that decision, and I just want to give them as much visibility ahead of time as possible into.
It sounds like we are all on board just based on what I'm hearing for comments, right?
In terms of kind of
an
exploring,
operating,
but
right?
We're going to have to figure out.
The number.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that if you do the poll, the questions target kind of that question of kind of, how much is too much, and start to give the board a zone to work with. The reason I put 8 million, 10 million, 10 million in my kind of example slides is probably anything less than that would require some significant cuts to the budget that could potentially hamper kind of our positive academic momentum and growth. And if you were to go above that kind of 10, 10, 12, 12, kind of I worry about like our disciplined budget process and ways of working, of continuously having to evaluate is everything that we're doing the highest leverage strategy, right? So the 8, 8, 10, 10 seemed like an okay starting place, because it still would require the $2 to $3 million cuts a year kind of way of working without really putting a pause on some of the great work that we've been doing. But I think that's kind of the question for the community to answer. We know we need to make tough budget decisions. We do every year, and we're not hiding from that. And can you support us in the great work of the district in line with the strategic framework and continuing our momentum moving forward? Does that help, Kate? I don't know.
It does, yeah. I just want to surface anything else sooner than later, and this question we can continue to answer. That I don't want to come up with some, great ideas of budget cuts in December and then, have it be too late. So Ananda and then Ali.
I'm just curious, I appreciate like you talking about the 8, 10, 10. For me, it would be helpful to have like a range. You're saying 8 would be like ideal, but it was to be having cuts. What is the range? Where would be your ceiling for the first couple of years? Yes.
I think the ceiling is probably the $10 million of the budget gap itself.
Ali?
Yeah, so I think looking at both cuts and unallocated resources is worthwhile examination. I think for me, in response to your question, Kate, I think the largest influencer is really going to be where the community comes out. And so I think there is a threshold for people in terms of, living on a fixed income or trying to navigate, your personal resources that we have to be considerate of and aware of. And so I think that is part of the reason the emphasis on community feedback is so relevant, because I think most people in Madison enthusiastically support public education in our schools and our kids and our teachers, and also navigate the reality of their own income. And so I think that's the major factor we as a board are responsible for examining, and I think that will set the tone for some of the scale and scope of what we're able to do. And so I think the sooner and more robust a dialogue we can have informed by community feedback, the better. And I think that's an ongoing dialogue that we're responsible for in the long term.
Chris?
I think it would be helpful to get more information on how the two referenda work together, the building referendum and the operating referendum. On one hand, you've got the cumulative effect of two tax increases working together, and we need to know more about how taxpayers are going to perceive that and react to that. And at the same time, there could be synergies between the two. Is there any evidence out there that going to a building referendum and improving the condition of our buildings could increase enrollment and revenue? And I think that's another piece of the question. If there's synergistic benefits, it could be that we don't actually have to take advantage of the full operating referendum down the road because we're increasing enrollment. So that would actually be really helpful information to know, like not just the tax burden, but also the potential for synergy by doing these two referenda together.
Just kind of piggybacking off what Chris just said, and I really appreciate that point, is how does, remodeling a school or investing in a school increase the value of a person's home, right? So does the resale value of your home, as indicated by the quality of schools in your neighborhood, what are the implications of that in the long term, and how do we frame that benefit for folks?
So for me, I guess some of the things that I would really like to see this group work on over the course of the fall is to exhaust other avenues for revenue increases, or some of the thoughts around cuts that don't harm kids and or make us a less attractive place to work. I mean, I do think it's incumbent on us to really push hard, so past the $2 to $3 million a year in terms of cuts, but really push hard. I'd love to aim for 5.588 instead of 8.8 10.10, and if we can't get there, then we have a different discussion. But I'd like to kind of push ourselves to hold a little bit, I guess, back. And again, I don't know if that's possible, but I do think that the work this fall, I'm hoping, will uncover some of those answers. I mean, Kelly, I want to just name this because, like, you did lay out a plan B, essentially, if this group had said, no, we don't want to go to an operating to exceed referendum. And the plan B has very significant changes to how we support our staff, and I think makes us a much less attractive place to work. The quality of our staff is a pretty key component of our kids' education, so I don't want to explore all of those things, but I do want to just name that there are other paths here that we as a group right now are giving administration guidance to not explore as the first lever. Is like, that's what I'm hearing, and so I want to just name that really clearly, and if that's not, Kelly, what you're hearing or what other people are saying, then we should clarify, so.
Maybe clarify that just a little bit more.
Well, I think what I hear us saying, or how about this, Kelly, why don't you say do you have what you need from us and frame what you're hearing
So
from
I
us?
think
and
I
then-
have what I need from you, which is I think I have your support to go out in our community feedback sessions regarding adding a potential second question to the referendum ballot, which would be to approve the authority to exceed our revenue limits. I think I have your support to use the 8, 10, 10 kind of range is just a starting point, knowing that our feedback is intended, back to I think Ananda said the range, is intended to see if we're in the right zone going up or going down. The other piece of which I'm hearing is that, the board wants to have these tough discussions and you're ready for them. And to start that, maybe earlier than January, so Lisa and I can look at that timeline and see what's possible and all that too. I just want to remind you that 83% of our budget is what was on that slide for my Plan B. It will be very hard pressed to find $10 million in the other 17% of our budget. Taking $10 million out of the system would be very difficult to totally protect students in the classroom. So I just want to make that clear. 83% of the budget was represented on that slide.
All right. Stevian? No? Any other commentary? All right, I think this was a good discussion.
I think this was a great discussion.
There's a bunch of follow-ups. We'll keep talking about this for the
sure.
next
Just
9
the
months,
beginning.
12 months, so thank you, Kelly. All right, do we have cash flow money too?
And then what time and then we have one session, closed session or two closed sessions, I can't
I think
remember.
we have one more
We have one second
topic
item.
on the agenda.
Oh, I didn't see
Very,
the
very
last
brief.
one.
Very,
I
very
didn't
brief.
see it.
Very brief. In front of you at the September regular board meeting will be an ask to action upon a $68 million tax revenue anticipation note, otherwise called a TRAN. It's basically a short-term loan that most school districts in the state need to do, Madison being one of them. We take out a loan at the beginning of the school year to help provide us with cash for cash flow purposes until we get the majority of our property tax money in January, and then another property tax kind of payment in August. And then when we receive the payment in August, that allows us to pay off our loan in September, and then next year the whole process would start again. So I'm just taking a minute to make sure that this is on your radar. It is $1 million less than the year before, which is good news. It'll reduce our interest payments by just a little bit. The way this will look is that it'll be an item to action upon in your September regular board meeting, but you will have, when you look at it to prep, there will be no documents attached. And that's because our bid is the morning of the board meeting.
Oh.
We only have a 24-hour period once the bid goes out to confirm the winner, so there's a important timing item here. So we'll go out to bid for the $68 million. People will respond, select the winning bidder the morning of the regular board meeting. I will then quickly work with my team to develop the materials that you all need. I'll post them into the board docs by early afternoon that Monday. I will also email them to you so you know when they're there and they're accessible. And then when we get together that night in the board meeting, I will need your vote to approve the winning bidder. That very night, Barb will keep behind Nikki or others that we need your signatures, and we will be acting the very next day of the board meeting on this particular borrowing process. So since it's the first time through for everybody, I just wanted to flag that for you, make sure it's on your radar. Any questions?
Why don't we give you authority now for this? I'm confused.
Because I don't know who's going to win.
We can't,
She doesn't have a number yet or a.
Like, I don't know which bank is gonna wanna be the one to loan us the money. We have to take this to a public opening bid, it's almost like an auction. And they start bidding, and we select the lowest bidder. And that has to happen, like, in the same time period. And since you're together in September, it has been our ongoing process to use the September regular board meeting for this process. We need the money by October. That's kind of the main reason for September.
Has the bank selected been consistent?
No. No. It changes quite often. And, you know, these are fractions of a difference of an interest rate. But at this amount of money, a fraction of someone outbidding someone else, their portfolios change all the time. So whether they need us in their portfolio or not is kind of the decisions that they're making, which is why it changes every year.
What is the interest rate we're hoping to get?
You know, that's a really good question. I will send you the materials from last year. Interest rates have changed a little bit from last year, so they're probably going to be a bit higher than last year. But because we have the best S&P ratings, S&P +1, we typically get a very, very good interest rate. But it's a good point. I'll send you the materials from last year so you can get an idea of what they look like. I probably should attach them tonight.
Thank you.
All right. That is the close of this part of our discussion. So do you have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Your advisory vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we are adjourned.
So are we going straight into close? Or
I think, can we take 1 minute break? Given it
Where's Savion?
BWP and Associates contract to conduct
Where
the
does Savion?
superintendent search. We have, oh yeah, turn that off. Okay, all right, Savion. All right. So it is, we are in open session again. We have one item left on the agenda, and that's the vote on the contract with BWP and Associates to conduct the superintendent search. I move that the Board of Education approve entering into a contract with BWP and Associates as set forth in the document prepared for the special meeting of the Board of Education dated September 16, 2019.
Second.
Okay,
Very eager.
any discussion?
Actually, just a procedural question. Did we have to vote to go back into session? Because we voted to end session.
No, we just called the meeting to
Okay.
order at
Okay.
the beginning. Yeah, she called the meeting to
Yeah, I
order.
didn't know either.
Yep, okay. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion passes.
Yeah.
Yay,
Alright.
glad we have a search firm.
Congratulations,
Congrats,
everybody.
everyone. Great work.
And we have a
Okay.
meeting Wednesday night to kick off that discussion
Yep.
in open session with our new firm partners.
All right. So now, we have a few items on the agenda for closed session. It is recommended that the Board of Education go into closed session for the purpose of considering negotiating strategy regarding collective bargaining base wages for all MMSD bargaining units pursuant to Wisconsin State Statute 19.82, reviewing disciplinary proceedings and discuss, and decisions involving individual students pursuant to Wisconsin State Statute Section 19.85, 118.125, and/or 120.13. And 3, consider